All right, so we're just going to be talking about Python. So brief history, Python was created in 1991 by a guy named Guido van Rossum. Hopefully I pronounced his name correctly. He actually started working on it in 1989. I think he was trying to accomplish some project and just felt like the existing programming languages that were available at that time weren't to his liking. So he actually just created his own language, which is kind of cool. One fun fact about Python is actually named after Monty Python's Flying Circus show. This was a show I think that ran in the 70s and maybe 80s. I've not seen that show. I did try to look up some YouTube clips just because I wanted to know what it's about, but that is what Python is named after. So it was developed to actually be developer friendly. So it was meant to be easy to read and use for developers. So I actually learned Python not too long ago, and I find it kind of a joy to use. It's very intuitive. My original, or I guess my main language is C++, which is kind of on the other spectrum. It's kind of difficult to use. It involves importing and like kind of downloading a lot of things, add-ons. Python kind of has a lot of things just built into it. So again, it's really easy to just get up and running and not having to worry about configurations and make files and all the other headaches you might get with other languages. Python is popular for many fields out there, notably game development, working with databases and servers. Python is pretty popular in machine learning, data analytics, and the scientific community. Again, just because it's easy to use and it's very versatile. So I think Python, again, if you looked up, if you did a quick Google of like the top 5 programming languages currently, I bet Python and JavaScript are going to be in those top 5. So you are learning very applicable languages through our program. But yeah, so that's a brief history about Python. So as I mentioned before, Python is very similar to JavaScript. I'm not going to go through all the similarities because that's just going to take up the entire day, but they are both high-level languages. So when we say high level, that just means it sits further away from machine code. So lower level languages are C, C++. They tend to be faster because, again, there's less conversion that has to happen from going from the programming language to machine language. But again, with that being, I guess, lower level languages, there's more, I guess, overhead that you have to do yourself. So yeah, Python and JavaScript are high-level languages. Both languages are dynamic. They use interpreters. What we mean by that is when you write a Python file or a JavaScript file, there's nothing that's going to really compile that code before you run it. As you run the code, it's going to be evaluated line by line. So this is different than, say, C++, where it's actually going to compile your code, and if there's any errors, it will catch such errors ahead of time. So it's kind of safer in that aspect where if you write something that's not going to work, compilers can kind of catch that and say, hey, this doesn't make sense, you got to fix it. Versus in Python or JavaScript, you're more likely to have errors during runtime just because there's nothing really checking other than like syntax and stuff. There's nothing checking for logical errors. All right, so again, a lot of similarities, but I think the key things to mention are the differences. So let's actually just get into a coding window and kind of see these languages side by side. So I'm going to create a hello.js file. So that'll be my JavaScript code. I'm going to create a hello.python file. And let's put these side by side. So I know Chad kind of showed off the split window approach. So I think that'd be a good time to use it. So I'm going to have JavaScript on the left and Python on the right side. All right, so I'm actually just going to go through our curriculum and kind of grab some code. So I'm going to grab JavaScript here, dump that down there, and Python. So it's going to point out some differences. We'll talk about that a little more in detail. But again, both the code on the right and left side are doing the exact same thing. The left side over here is JavaScript, and the equivalent Python code is over here. I guess the only difference is we have comments here. So I'm going to get these out of the way. All right, so comments are a little different too, but again, we have a function that basically takes in a value and outputs whether that value is greater or less than or equal to 5. All right, so some things I want to point out here. Some things to notice right off the bat. JavaScript uses curly braces to define blocks of scope. Notice that there's no such curly braces being used here in Python. These are just syntax differences. So for Python, the delimiters are new lines and tabs. Right, so when I create a new line here, it automatically knows that, that's the end of that expression. And these tabs also are used for blocks. So what I mean by that in JavaScript, for example, I could tab this in really weird ways. I could, do this. Sorry. Let me make this a little smaller. Is that too small, or can you guys still read that?
We can see it.
Okay, I think I heard good from 2 people, maybe. If it's too small, let me know. I can blow it up again. But again, you can format things in any way you want in JavaScript. It's still going to work. Obviously, whoever's reading your code is going to probably be mad at you for writing poorly formatted code. But this will work the same way as it had it before. The spacing and the tabbing does not matter. That's not true in Python. You must tab items appropriately. So if I did not tab this out, I would get a syntax error. Notice I get some red squiggly lines here. That's because Visual Studio Code knows how Python should be formatted. So it's actually kind of identifying some errors here for me, right? So a tab defines a new block of scope. So instead of using curly braces as we do here, we just use a new line and add a tab here. Oops, add a tab here that's going to say, hey, this is a block of code for this if statement. All right, some other things you notice, we use the DEF or definition keyword instead of function. Again, small syntax differences like that, we'll point them out as we kind of get into learning Python. But some kind of higher level or more conceptual differences. So I know Tom talked about hoisting yesterday. That is something that does not exist in Python. So again, this is, as I mentioned, a lot of similarities. I'm just going to kind of highlight a few differences. So we talked about hoisting. Let's code around, but the idea of hoisting is if I have a function, let's say function my func. Let's just say this just returns my number +1, whatever. I can call this function before I even define it. So I could do console log my func, and let's pass it a number, so 5. Let's give this a try. I'm going to bring up my terminal with control tilde, and I'm going to make that a little lower. Okay, so I'm going to do node, what is it, hello.js. Right, notice I got 6 because this function is defined after I actually call it here, but JavaScript is okay with that. So this function gets hoisted above here. If I try to do the same thing in Python, just to prove it to you guys, hope you guys can take my word for it though. If I do the same thing in Python, if I did print, so we didn't talk about output, but print is the equivalent of console log in Python. So just get familiar with that. I did my func and pass it a 5. Let's create a function. So create a function, we use def, give it a name. Num. Again, we don't use curly braces, we use a colon for functions, and return num. Right, same thing going on here, but if I try to run this, Python, notice we get an error. It's saying, hey, my func is not defined because when it gets to line 12 over here, it has no idea about this function that's going to be defined. So again, hoisting does not exist in Python. So if I want to do this accurately, I'll need to create that function before I attempt to use it. There we go. So we get a 6, same result, nothing too crazy there. All right, so hoisting does not exist. That's one key difference you might want to be aware of. Some other differences, Python has a larger standard library. So again, just more built-in stuff you can use right out of the box. That's kind of nice about Python. Python was developed with object-oriented programming in mind. Now, I know that's a buzzword we've maybe mentioned before. We'll learn a lot more about it next week, so stay tuned. But just know that Python was designed with OOP in mind versus JavaScript is known more as a scripting language. It does have some OOP kind of concepts built into it, but those are kind of added on more recently. It wasn't originally designed to kind of handle OOP programming. Yeah, there's, I guess the last difference, high level difference I want to mention is JavaScript is kind of like the wild, wild west of programming. You can do a lot of crazy things with JavaScript and they'll kind of let you. So like I could do something like, let's create a variable, let x equals 7, let y equal donuts. If I did something like console log x plus y. That will totally fly. You're adding an integer to a string, but JavaScript is kind of lax on rules, so I could just do that. If I do hello.js, notice I get 7 donuts, no problem there. If I try to do something similar in Python, we'll do x equals 7, or y equals donuts. One thing I guess I should point out, when you're declaring variables in Python, notice you don't need any keywords to kind of declare variables. Notice we use let, we have to use let or const or var in JavaScript. In Python, you just create something and assign something to it, and Python will say, all right, I know you're creating a variable. You don't have to kind of specify that with your code. Again, that's kind of like the user friendliness or developer friendliness of it, where it's kind of easier to write and quicker to write Python. So if I try to do the same thing here, print out x plus y, I don't believe Python will be happy with that. So use Python. To run Python applications, I guess I didn't mention that, you want to use your Python application that you installed during install test, and then the name of the file, so hello.py. Notice I get an error. It's like, hey, what are you trying to do here? You're trying to add an integer to a string. That's not cool with me. So Python, again, is a little more strict on rules. And for me, that's a positive because I like having that protection. Like, it doesn't really make sense. I don't see a real use case of adding an integer to a string, but JavaScript will let you do it. So just kind of know that JavaScript is a little more lax on those sorts of things. So it can be a pro or a con. You could do a lot more, I guess, different things with JavaScript, but then again, you're going to have less protections. So you might get into some weird states with JavaScript that you might not get into with Python. All right, cool. So that's kind of just the introductory differences between the two languages. Let's kind of get back to learning Python. So let me uncomment this stuff. Since we're talking about commenting, simple first thing I will learn about is comments. So comments in JavaScript are / my comments. In Python, you simply use the hashtag or the pound symbol. So my comment. Right? Comments are the same, just different syntax for those. We talked about input, but just kind of go over that one more time. If I want to print something out in Python, I use the print statement. So print hello world. That's the same thing as doing a console log. So just, again, this happens to me. I assume it's going to happen to some of you when you're writing challenges in both Python and JavaScript, kind of like back to back. You'll probably get them confused and write the wrong thing half the time. At least I do. So, all right. So that's printing out the console. Nothing too crazy going on there. Any questions so far about just general Python items? Okay, I'm kind of gonna get rid of JavaScript for now. Let's get rid of that. All right, so let's focus on Python. So going back to our curriculum page, let's kind of learn more about variables. So I'm gonna copy the section and highlight some more differences. So copying this section of Python code. Okay, so there's different variable types, but they're a little different than what you might expect or get in JavaScript. So one first difference I want to mention, there's no real idea of constant variables, right? So we have that const keyword in JavaScript that does not exist. There's no notion of constant values in Python. The convention is if you are declaring a value that is meant to be constant, use all caps. So notice I have a constant variable here, b, or my const var has a value of b. Anyone reading this code should just be aware that, okay, this is all caps, this value should not change. But there's nothing preventing it from changing. Versus in JavaScript, if I had something called const and some variable name, that value would not be able to be changed. I would get an error if I tried to actually change a constant value in JavaScript. Another thing you might have noticed is the way we write variables and function names. In JavaScript, if I can bring that back up, we use something called camel case. So notice that my function is called is greater than 5. The format or the format for writing out values and naming stuff is lowercase first word. So I have a lowercase I. Then I want every other word is going to be capitalized and lowercase for the rest of the letters. So it's called camel case because you kind of have these humps in the middle that kind of remind you of camels. So that's camel case for JavaScript. For Python, the standard is using snake case. That's where you use underscores to separate words. So my function is my underscore func. Also, my other local variable is other underscore local variable, all in lowercase. Now understand that this is a convention, but not a requirement. There's nothing stopping me from using snake case. I could say, my new var. This is totally fine. Nothing's gonna break. No one's gonna really care, except you're not following standards. And when we talk about standards, it is best practice to follow typical coding conventions, because usually when you're working on a team, it's best when everyone has the same, when agrees on the same format, the same stylizing, because that just makes it easier to work with someone else's code, right? If I write code in my style and then hand it off to Jason, and Jason's working with it, he's like, it's hard for me to understand. This is not the a style I'm used to. It just slows down progress and kind of just leads confusion and frustration. So try to follow style guidelines for a particular language. So in Python, use snake case instead of camel case for variables and function names. All right, so continuing on, just talking about variables. Global variables, again, they should be accessible by kind of anyone in the file. Constant variables don't really exist, but use capital or all caps for defining values that you intend to be constant. When you get into a function, you can create a local variable. So this will be available anywhere in the function. You can also create a variable inside of a block of scope. So if I create other local variable here, I can still use it outside of this block, outside the scope. So is the concept of scope familiar to you guys? Anyone have any questions on what I mean when I say scope? Okay, so scope is kind of, the way I kind of envision it is just like a neighborhood. When you're in that neighborhood, you have access basically to everything that you would expect. And then when you go out of the neighborhood, things kind of become out of place. But in this case, I create a variable, other local var in this scope. That scope ends after this block of code is executed. I could have multiple lines here. I could say, do something, whatever. When this block of code ends, that scope has effectively been removed from the context, but this variable still lives outside of that scope. That's not true for all languages. For example, in C++, I know I mentioned that a lot just because I've worked with it a lot, but if you create a variable in some scope, when that scope ends, that variable dies, as in it no longer exists. That's not true for Python. Okay. However, local variables do die or go out of scope from functions. So if a function ends, so this function block, everything I highlight here is my function block. I define something called local var inside of that function. When that function is no longer in scope, that local var no longer exists. Because that function scope has ended, local var has been deleted from memory. So you will get an error if you try to run this code, because this print statement has no idea what local var is. Any questions on declaring variables or using variables or different variable types?
Will we talk about the equivalent in JavaScript in a little bit, or contrast?
Yeah, we can absolutely do that right now. Good to kind of use a language that we know. And so we want to write something similar. Let's give that a try. So if I copy this. Oops. Okay, so might need to minimize a little bit. So if we want to create variables, again, in JavaScript, we need to use keywords. So if I want a variable here, I'll use let. If I want a constant variable here, I'll use const. If I need comments, obviously you need to use double slash. Okay, so now I have a global variable here that's accessible pretty much anywhere. I have a constant variable that cannot be changed. Again, this is a little different. So if I actually tried to change const var and set that equal to b, this would be an error. And I guess if you want to actually see that, let's actually see that in play. So clear node for JavaScript, hello.js. Notice you get an error. So assignment to a constant variable, because I told JavaScript that I do not want this value to change. It's going to protect me. So JavaScript will protect you in certain cases, but on average, it will protect you less than Python will. But yeah, so let's go back. Okay, let's kind of just convert this. This is my Python file. I'm just going to convert it to JavaScript. So we use the function keyword in JavaScript versus we use the def to define a function. Again, anytime we declare variables, we need a let. Another thing, we use curly braces. So I'm going to have to add these in here. Let's comments Another thing I want to mention, because I do this a lot, but I'm not sure if I should do a lot. For if statements in JavaScript, you actually don't always need to have curly braces. So what I have here will actually work. And this is kind of a special case. And since it's a special case, I don't want to kind of get you into a bad habit. But if you only have one line of code in your if or else block, you don't need to add a curly brace. So for example, I could add curly braces here, and usually it's better practice to add curly braces to create a block of scope. But for the special case where you only have one line in that block, you do not have to add curly braces. I'm just mentioning this because sometimes when I'm coding, I might not have that curly brace. You might be freaking out. So understand it's going to work, but best practice is to have those curly braces. The reason being, right now, this is going to work. But if I add a new line of code like do something, let's say I'm calling a function called do something, this is not going to work because now I have two lines of code, but JavaScript is saying, okay, this is part of your block. This line of code is just kind of somewhere that doesn't belong to this if block. So it's always good to kind of have those curly braces. So in case you need to add extra lines, it's not going to kind of break on you. So I'm just going to add those in there like that. So that will work without the curly braces. It would work the first time also. All right, so let's kind of just run this out to see the equivalents. Any questions as I'm typing this out? I should probably change the casing of this or the format of this because we talked about camel case. So I'll try to update all these, but you guys get the idea, hopefully. Question is, will other local var be accessible in JavaScript? So let's find out together. Local var. All right, I'm not going to change the 2 above because I'm just going to be lazy. Huh? Okay, so we're going to call my function. My function is just simply going to check if the value is greater or less than that, but it's not actually doing anything with that. Okay, so let's run this and see what happens. Hopefully I don't have any errors. Okay. Yep. So in JavaScript, you can't that variable will die in that scope when you use the lets. This is one of the cases where you might want to use var, but you really need a good purpose to use this if you want to design your code that way. So the let keyword basically creates a variable that will only exist for that scope. So notice I got an error saying other local var does not exist at this point because it was declared inside of a different scope that has now ended. However, if I change this to a var, this should work. So if you want the equivalent of what Python is doing, you could use the var keyword, define a variable inside of a scope. When that scope ends, the variable is still going to exist. So if I run this, hopefully I won't get any errors. Yep, there we go. We got C printed out because that's local variable, and then D printed out because that's other local var. All right, so again, some differences you got to be aware of between JavaScript and Python, but for the most part, it should be pretty straightforward to work in one or the other. Cool, good question. Any other questions? All right, so we talked about commenting, input, output, basic syntax and style. So again, just remember snake case, camel case. Remember, instead of curly braces, use tabbing. So if you do not have stuff tabbed correctly, you will get errors. Just know that you'll probably run into it, but you'll adjust to it in no time, I'm sure. All right, let's continue on. Let's talk about data types. So I'm gonna get rid of this code. Data types. All right, so we have items called primitive data types. Again, you should be familiar with these from JavaScript. So the 4 main ones I'm gonna highlight here are common friends that you've dealt with. We have Booleans. So Booleans can be true or false. The only small difference between JavaScript and Python, in JavaScript, I guess I should stop taking away this file. In JavaScript, when you declare a variable that's a Boolean, use lowercase true or lowercase false. That y equals false, right? So lowercase t, lowercase f for true or false. Only slight difference in Python, capital T, capital false, or capital F. Right, so those are Booleans. They work the same way. They're yes, no value. Integers, again, nothing surprising here. You can create integers, you just assign to them. Again, you don't need to have any keyword for when you're declaring variables. So A, B, C, and D, they're getting created. I'm not telling Python, hey, this is where I'm creating my variable. It just knows. Right, so 1, make that 7. You guys understand integers, so I won't go on further. You have floating point numbers, so if I want 3.14, just use a decimal and I get a floating point number. Strings, same thing that Tom talked about yesterday. You create strings, single quotes, double quotes. If I want E equals cupcakes, that works too. We talked about string interpolation, so this is the only slight adjustment you'll comment, but string interpolation exists in Python as well, but the syntax is a little different. So let's go through that. So if I want to create, let's say, breakfast, probably not the healthiest breakfast, but I'm going to create a breakfast string saying, I had cupcakes for breakfast. Oops, sorry, I want this to be value E. I'll just say. All right, so if you want to use string interpolation, basically you just create a string and then you want to drop an F right before it. A little odd, but this F, I'm not sure if this is exactly the case, but I just always treat this F as formatting. So this is an F string. You'll hear us and probably other people use the terminology F string. It just means an interpolated string. So notice when I added that F, my syntax highlighting in Visual Studio or VS Code kind of changed my highlighting there, so that food became, everything between the curly braces became white. So if I delete the F, now this is just literally curly braces and food. But when I add the F there, it's going to treat this as Python code. So it's going to know that this is a variable that it should try to read. So if let's do a print breakfast and see what happens. Clear Python. All right, so these items, I'm printing the type, so that's something we'll talk about. But down here, I had cupcakes for breaks. Apparently, I can't type like this. All right, so I had cupcakes. If I want to add in donuts instead, I'll put in the value D. Nothing crazy going on here, but again, string interpolation exists for Python as the main takeaway. The only thing you got to know is use F and then just have a string after it. So you don't have to do backticks or anything like that in Python. Since I was using this method, there is a function called type, similar to what I think Tom went over yesterday. If you want to investigate what type of value is, you just use the type function. Notice I get the type of data type it is. I get bool, int, float, and string, or str for string for A, B, and C. Okay, those are primitive data types. Again, just the basic building blocks of creating values. Then we have something called non-primitive data types, and I refer to these as data structures. That's usually what you'll be familiar with. Data structures, again, very similar to what we have in JavaScript. We have arrays in JavaScript. In Python, they're simply called lists, but for the most part, they behave exactly the same way. So arrays in JavaScript, lists in Python, they're essentially the same data structure. So lists are ordered containers. So if you insert an item in the first index, it's always going to come before the second index. I'm going to copy this code over, and let's have a fun little quiz. So again, this is a list. You can have same values. So in this case, my list has the Fibonacci sequence here of integers. Indexing, you use square brackets. Again, same thing in JavaScript. So if I do square brackets 4, that's going to be the 5th index in my list. So again, we're always 0 based. So square brackets 4 is going to do index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this should print out index 4, which is item number 5. I guess that's a little confusing because I have 5 there. I probably should have had a better example. Let's just do some random numbers. Not 4, 77. All right, so if I do index 4, that should print out the 77. Right, because we're always 0 based. So it's programming always 0 based. Okay, so let's have a little quiz here. I'm going to call in some people. Hopefully you're ready for it. I have 4 print statements here, and I created my other list. So the thing I want to highlight with my other list is you could have multiple different data types within your list, right? In this case, I'm mixing and matching an integer. I have a string. I have another integer. I even have a list within a list. Totally fine. I have my other list from up here, and I also have another string. So let me get my Fibonacci sequence back in case, we'll do that, that's numbers. Okay, so my first print statement is attempting to access my other list, index 3, index 3. I am gonna call on someone, so hope you're on your toes. Well, I talked to you today. Kana, can I ask you, what do you think this is gonna print out for my other list? Let me give you more space here so you can see everything. My other list is defined on line 5. I want to print out index 3, index 3. What do you think this will print out?
4.
4. So let's actually test this out. So Python, hello Pi. So kind of said 4. Let's see if she's right. Oops, yeah, she is right. I have one more print statement up here. All right, so we got 4. Kana, can you tell me why you knew the answer was 4?
Well, when I essentially started at the beginning and counted 0. The index 0 is 1, index 1 is donuts, index 2 is 7, index 3 is the list.
Yep.
And then I did the same thing again to get, like, walking down the index to get to the last 4.
Yep, great job. All right, cool. Thanks you so much, Kana. Let's call on someone else. Mary Ann, what do you think this will output? So I'm getting my other list, index 4, and then index 5.
Okay, the index 4 references the my list. So then I'm not sure what I go up to my list and go to index 5. 0, 1, 2, 3,
Yep,
4,
you parse
5.
that correctly. So
Number
look at
3.
Yep, 3. Oops, I have duplicates, but yeah, let's make that 33. So yeah, we'd expect 33. So yep, you did that exactly correct. So you take the first index and go through initial list. So we're looking at index 4, so that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we happen to have another variable in there. So that happens to be a list. So we now inspecting that list at index 5, which is the 6th item. In that case would be 33. Yep, so that's great. Thanks, Marianne. Oops. All right, next couple more here. Who do we have? Daniel Miller, what do you think the output to this print statement will be?
I'm gonna take a guess that it's either error or undefined.
Okay. I think, yes, so we'll get an error. You are correct. What if I change this to 3?
Then will we get A?
Yep. Yeah, so Daniel is correct. We would get an error with this because we're trying to access item number 6, which is pop-up, and we're trying to access index number 4. So this is something I guess maybe I skipped over, so apologies for that. Strings effectively can be treated as arrays. So we have a string, let's say x equals hello papa. This, again, strings can be indexed in the same way that arrays can. So if I wanted to grab a letter out of here, I could do something like x3. This will reference the 4th letter in my string. So just kind of understand that strings effectively behave like lists in many ways. So hopefully I didn't catch anyone off guard, but yeah, Daniel was correct. If we did index 5, which is pop-up, get the 3rd item, not 4th, we should get an A. So let's do that. Yep, we got an A. If we did a 4th item, we would get an error. Oops, what happened? Here we go. So we get actually an error, string index out of range. It's trying to access, the 5th item here, but there's no 5th item. This is a little different than JavaScript. So I know we're kind of going back and forth. Hopefully you guys can stay with me. JavaScript, again, a little more lax. It's not gonna throw an error. It's just gonna kind of proceed and go as if nothing else matters. So if I had a string of papa, and I tried to do something like console log s index 4, or x index 7, doesn't really matter. We try to do this. What do you think will be printed out to the console?
Undefined.
Yep. So let's, I'm gonna highlight another point, another difference between JavaScript and Python for me. So we get undefined. This is not an error. Our application still ran. Like if we had another line of code here, I did console log donuts, it'll still print out donuts. My application did not crash or abort. I still get both outputs. If I did the same in Python, it won't get to my last line. So I did print donuts, it would not get to that. Oops. Let's do Python hello UI. So notice it got an error on line 11. It just aborted my application. It did not get down to print donuts, which makes me sad because I want to see donuts. Okay, so that's another data type that I want to bring up. So in JavaScript, you have an idea of null, and you also have an idea of undefined. Can someone wager a guess, or not even a guess? Can someone tell me the difference between null and undefined?
Null is just empty and undefined is undefined.
Yeah, so yeah, so it might be a little confusing. Just kind of they may seem like they're the same thing, but null, when you use null, you're explicitly setting something to be equal to nothing. So you're saying if I have a variable, let y equal null, you are saying that y explicitly is going to equal nothing. That's different than having undefined, where JavaScript does not know what it actually is. So undefined, you get that when, again, you get cases like this, you're accessing index 7 that doesn't exist. JavaScript is going to let you go forth with it. It's going to say, hey, I have no idea what this value is. It's undefined. That's the default type. Python does not have a concept of undefined. So that does have a value of none. So sorry, I'm writing a lot of code in weird places, but there's a value of none. That's the same thing as null in JavaScript. So these two things are the same. Python has none, capital N. JavaScript has null. However, there's no such equivalent for undefined in Python. Something has to have a definition in Python, else it'll be an error. Questions? What questions do you guys have?
So I just have one quick question. Just for my understanding, make sure I'm getting null. Null is essentially like a placeholder in JavaScript. Like if we want to like have it, the code run, but not be undefined.
Sort of. Again, it has use cases where, again, if you're trying to do things kind of properly, like if I'm trying to do like my favorite number, let's say we want to take a user input, there's no real default value you can have for favorite number, right? There's no like default favorite number that everyone has, right? Like I can't just say equals 7 or even 0. Like 0 is a number, but that's not actually like the default favorite number for everyone. So this is where I would use none, because that better represents like, hey, there's actually no default value I have for a favorite number. Once I get a user input, I can update my favorite number from the user input. So this would be the more correct way to do it, because you don't want to have 0, because 0 still is a number, right? So that could be someone's favorite number. I don't know. I don't think I've met anyone that has 0 as a favorite number, but it's totally valid. So again, you don't want to use 0 as your default value.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So yeah, null and none is usually a good, you use it when you don't have an acceptable default value, right? That's a little different than like,
Yeah, so what about when you're just using like, when you just set it to an empty value, you know, when you just have like empty quotes or an empty array or something like that, what would be, I felt like that would be kind of the same.
Glad you brought up this question. So we have 3 variables here. We have empty quotes, empty lists, and none. So this is still something. Empty string is still something that exists. It's like a blank string. Same thing with a list. You still created something that has nothing in it. And I know that kind of seems like I'm just jumbling words there, but these 2 lines are different, because I could do something like y append and add a value in there. I can't do the same thing with z. Z append donuts, because y, we've told Python that y is a list, so we can add items into that list because it already knows how to work with lists. Z is just nothing. Like, just imagine like a blank empty void of space. So we can't append anything to it because it doesn't know what append is. It's not a list, doesn't have that method available. With a string, you know, we can add characters to a string. We can't add characters to nothing. I don't know if that cleared anything up or if I confused you more.
No, that helped out a
Okay.
lot.
Yeah, so these are still kind of like, empty items, but they're still items versus none is not even an item. It's just nothing. Like the concept of nothing, it just doesn't exist.
Ankur, in Python primitives, if I add together or combine a float and an integer, is the result a float or an integer?
Good question. Let's test it out. So it's going to be a floating point. So if I do this, do console, let me get rid of my example here. I think you guys passed my quiz up here. Good job to everyone. I don't want to do console log. See, I'm doing it again. Print x plus y. So this, yeah, it won't automatically convert to an int. I know some languages might be a little more picky, but this would be 8.4. So yeah, it'll automatically do that conversion. It's not going to complain. Like when I tried to add an integer and a string, obviously it complained. For numbers, it's a little more forgiving, as it's going to convert that to a float and handle it gracefully.
And you had foreshadowed something when we were talking about math.floor in Python. What was that? Like, let's say we wanted to force the integer, like we wanted to cast that value to an integer. How would we do that in Python?
Great question. I'm glad you brought that up. Sure, let's go over that. Yeah, so that's one key difference. So the operators in JavaScript and Python are pretty similar, but I will highlight those differences just because it's good to know about. So I forget who mentioned it, but someone did, and they were onto the game. So let's say I'm doing a math operation. Let's go with x equals 42, with 42, and then let's say y equals 10. All right, so we're doing a similar computation earlier. So if I did something like print x divided by y, that should be 4.2, I'd expect. Let's verify that. Yep, we got 4.2. What if we want to round this down? What if we want that to be an integer? So let me get my split windows going on here. So in JavaScript, we can do something very similar, but x equals 42, y equals 10, and we do console log x log y. Right? Both these will do the same exact thing. I don't know why I have extra lines up here. Both are going to print out 4.2. In JavaScript, we have access to a math library that has a for function. This lets us round down. So this will convert this down to a 4. So let's see both of these in action, just so everyone is on the same page. So let me run my JavaScript file. So I use node hello.js. Right, now let's get 4.2, and then we'll use 4, that rounds down to the nearest integer, we get 4. There are a few ways to do this in Python. Someone mentioned an operator, and that's quite a handy operator. There's an operator that exists in Python that's double slash. This is basically dividing without remainder. That's the same thing as essentially doing a for operation. But again, Python, just developer friendly. You can just do double slash slash, and it'll do the same exact thing. So if I do Python hello JS, what happened there? And now it's, oh, sorry. I ran my JavaScript file with Python. Yep, shame on me. I want to run my Python file with Python. Okay, so we get 4.2 and 4. Same thing, just much more convenient, I think, to use double slash rather than using math.floor. I believe there's an equivalent for, I could probably Google it because I don't remember offhand. Python for function. I'm sure that one exists. Yeah, for. So I could use for and it would do the same thing. For x, y, and now we're just using the same function, same result. And that's fine because we need to import something like this.
Yeah, it's the math.
Yep. So in JavaScript, that math library is automatically available. This is a good time to talk about imports. So similar to what we were doing before for our Roman numerals challenge, sometimes you need to import some other files, just some other libraries. So the way to do it is use the import keyword and then whatever library you want to import. So math is a built-in library that exists, but you need to include it. It's not going to automatically be included. So in this case, if I want to use it, I'll do math.floor. Versus JavaScript, this math library automatically is kind of just available. So here my console. Okay, same thing. But I prefer double equals, don't have to import anything, much quicker. So I'm going to skip that. So yep, that's one additional operator we have in Python that doesn't exist in JavaScript. While we're talking about kind of operators and such, In JavaScript, you, as Tom went over yesterday, if we're doing an if statement, let's say if x equal y, we have double equals in JavaScript, and we also have triple equals. I'm going to call on someone just because I like kind of putting people on the spot. Actually, no, I don't, but hopefully everyone knows the answer here. Jonathan Ray, what's the difference between triple equals and double equals?
Triple equals is alike in type and value, whereas double equals is just value.
Yep, well said. So again, in JavaScript, there's a concept of double equals, which means if I compare x and z, in this case, this will be equal because this 42 string and 42 integer will be coerced into the same data type. So I'm not sure which way it goes. I think the integer will be coerced into a string, and then that's what double equals does. However, for triple equals, you need to have the same value and data type. So in this case, I have a string here, I have a integer here. This will not be equal with triple equals because it's a different data type. Triple equals, double equals, that concept doesn't exist in Python. It's always double equals. So if I want to do if x equals y, oops. Okay. So if x equals y, I know we haven't talked about if statements, but we will print something equals. So this double equals is the same thing as triple equals in JavaScript. I have not encountered this double equals, triple equals in any other programming language. It might exist, but for the most part, most programming languages will always have just double equals, and that is checking data type and value, right? So this is equal to triple equal sign. Cool. Question, was there a raised hand out there?
I had a question about the import math. So let's say I'm working remotely. Importing math should work on any machine that has Python already installed, or is it reaching out and grabbing it from the internet and putting it on the computer?
Good question. Yeah, it's already installed on your machine. So when you went about the installation process, you got a whole bunch of libraries on your machine and available to you. So yeah, you're not pulling off the web. You don't need to be connected to the internet to kind of use that library. All the Python code, the baked-in code exists on your machine after you install Python. So you have access to it. You just got to kind of know what libraries have what functions that you're looking for. Stephen?
Yeah, I think my question I was to ask, so when the double equals on Python, like in that one it's comparing, is it comparing the ASCII values of both values to each other? And then the other one like supersedes it where it kind of ignores that basically, and then just compares like if you do the double with JavaScript, does it just override basically the ASCII and looks at different things kind of?
Sort of. There's something in JavaScript called coercion, where again, it's going to kind of just force this value to be something else. Yes, I'm pretty sure it's going to convert this integer to a string and then compare, the string values.
Okay, perfect. All right, thanks.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to go over one more thing, and I think we should take a break soon. So let's talk about operators since we're talking about them. In JavaScript, we have the exclamation equal. So if I do x not equal y, right? We're familiar with this. Exclamation means not, so we do that with the double equals, or sorry, triple equals or double equals. That means not equal. In Python, you want to use the not operator. So if I could do something like not x equal y, that's one way to do it. This is the same thing as doing this. So when you use an exclamation, not sure why that's. I need another set of parentheses here. This is basically negating the value I get out of here. I'm just going to bring this up because I know I had at least one or two students do this during the assessment, the pre-work assessment. This is not the same thing. So kind of be careful about how you use a not operator. There is operator precedence. So you could Google operator precedence. It's going to be like, multiplication happens before addition, right? That's basic math rules. Same thing with negation. So this negation happens before this comparison happens. So again, you don't really have to memorize it. You just kind of get familiar with it, but just kind of know this is going to negate the value of x and then compare that negated value to y. That's different than doing the comparison first and then doing it that way. Yeah, so if you try to do, that still works, but you can also use a not keyword. All right, cool. The only other, I think, difference that I need to mention here are ands and ors. So if you're familiar with in Python, if I do x equal y, and so and we do double ampersand, x equal z. I'm just gonna stop putting items in here, but you do and by doing double ampersand. You cannot do that in Python. So if I want to do the same in Python, I can't do double ampersand. Notice it's highlighted in angry red, telling me you're doing something wrong. Instead, in Python, you want to use the and keyword or the or keyword. So if I do if x equal y or x equals z. Right. So in JavaScript, you use double pipes for or, and you use ampersand for ands. Any questions about those operators?
In JavaScript, is it just one ampersand or is it two, or does it matter?
It can matter. Great question. Yeah, this would be a double. Thanks. That's my apologies for typo. You want to use and or for logical comparisons. I don't want to confuse you guys too much, but you can use single, and that usually will give you the same result, but it's not equivalent all the time. This is something called bitwise and this is called bitwise or. So when we get into binary numbers, you'll be using these operators if you're using binary numbers to kind of compare each bit and each bit and or each bit. Again, this is binary math and stuff like that. I'm not going to delve into that. But for the most part, always use and or. Those other operators exist, can be used, will usually give you the same result, but don't rely on that all the time.
Thank you.
Yep, great question. Okay, cool. I think we earned ourselves a break. So it's 11:03 on my end. Let's take a break till 11:13, and we'll kind of wrap up the rest of the introduction part. All right, see you guys in 9 minutes. All right, so we just finished up talking about compare operators. So again, just using the and or versus and the ampersand and pipes. But otherwise, same thing going on in either language, so we're good there. Let's continue on. So we talked about we're talking about data structures. So let's kind of continue on. We did our lists. There are some other data structures that might be familiar or might not be familiar. So there's something called a tuple in Python. This effectively is the same thing as a list, and you might be asking, well, why does it exist? Tuples are simply defined with curly braces or round braces instead of square brackets. So if I wanted to define tuple, I'll do my list. So do we have an example that I can copy? Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to copy that. You guys can read and kind of get the spoiler, but lists and tuples, very, very similar. So I have a list and a tuple. The only difference is tuples are what's known as an immutable data type. So you can think of that as like const. As I mentioned, you can't create a const variable, so there are kind of const data types. So a tuple you create with round parentheses instead of square brackets. They are still ordered containers, so A, B, C will be, that ordering will be preserved. But the only difference is you can't modify a tuple. And this comes into play when we talk about our next data type. So just know tuples list is effectively the same thing. Only difference is tuples can never be modified once you create them. All right, and there might be certain use cases, one I'll highlight shortly. So let's go on to our next data structure, which is the dictionary. Dictionaries in Python are essentially the same thing as objects in JavaScript. There are a few subtle differences, but for the most part, objects in Python or in JavaScript, if you're comfortable with those, dictionaries are the same thing. They're key value pairs. All right, so let's create a dictionary. I think we have an example here. All right, so dictionaries, again, key value pairs. So you can create keys as strings. You can use integers as keys. The only restriction is that your key value must be immutable, as in it must be consistent. That's why tuples can be useful. For example, I can have a tuple as a key for my dictionary. So if I wanted to, access this, I could do something like print my dictionary, and then I could access it via tuple 1, 2, 3. And let's see if that gives me what I want. Python hello.js. JavaScript again. Not sure why I keep doing it. Probably should have named my file a little different, but yeah. So I printed out, that tuple. So I got numbers printed out. If I wanted to make this a list, well, Python is not going to be too happy with me. Because notice I get unhashable type list. So that list could change, and that's not a valid key then. All right, so I guess I should change this, but yeah, that's not going to work. But yeah, dictionaries, again, objects and dictionaries, pretty similar. You can access an entry via square brackets. You pass in the key. So in this case, the key is donuts, and I should get yummy as my value out of it. So I think I had that before. Let me fix my key. All right, so notice I get yummy. This should be updated at the top of the thing. All right, so I get yummy because I accessed donuts. Notice that you can add keys dynamically. So I initially declared my dictionary. If I want to add a new key, simply specify the key name, specify the value, and then that's going to be in my dictionary. Any thoughts on dictionaries? Any questions, concerns?
So can you
Yeah.
only have a tuple as a key? Can you not have a list as a key?
Yes, yeah. So again, your key values must be immutable. So
Okay.
as we talked about, tuples are immutable, lists are not. As in, you can modify a list after you create it. Tuples can never change after you create a tuple.
Perfect.
So yeah,
Thanks.
that's why tuples can be handy. That's they exist for a reason, but there might be other use cases for tuples. But yeah, one difference that might be worth mentioning, not really a big deal, but good to know about. So we talked about objects in JavaScript. So if I want to create my objects, let's kind of just copy all these over. You should not rely on ordering with dictionaries or objects, but they are semi-ordered. So what I mean by that is, if you need something to be ordered, you should be using lists. As in, if you want something, one before the other, lists and arrays are considered ordered sequences or ordered data structures. Dictionaries are not meant to be ordered. Like different languages, like C++, I bring that up a lot. They have something called map. That is not going to be preserved ordering. As in, when you insert one item, insert another, there's no guarantee that you'll get the first item before the second item if you're like iterating through it. With that said, Python does preserve ordering for their dictionaries as of, I think, release 3.6. We all should be using 3.9. 3.6, I think, introduced preserving ordering. So if I want to highlight that quickly, let's just simplify this a little bit. So I'm going to add two values. I'm going to add food. It's going to be donuts, and let's add one as a key and say, all right, you can have numbers, you can have strings as your keys, it's all fine. If I want to print this out, so let's print out my dictionary. Since I added food first and then
Console log.
Oh, I'm in Python, but yes, I will need console log for JavaScript.
Sorry, wrong.
No, you're fine. Again, I get confused all the time too. So if I inserted food and then my one key next, that ordering will be preserved in Python. So I do this. Notice I get food as the first entry, one as the second. That is not true for JavaScript. So another subtle difference. So if I copy this over, and we'll have to adjust it. So I'm going to create my objects, just naming. All right, that's fine. Let's use JavaScript styling though. All All right, so notice that in this case, I inserted food first in 1 second, just like I did for Python. But if I run this in Node, because of JavaScript, I do have print, so I just hit that time, of course. Okay, notice that the one entry got kind of added before the food one. As in when I printed out, the ordering is different than when I inserted it. So in JavaScript, there's semi-ordering. I'm not gonna kind of confuse you guys. There's some logic to kind of how they do it. I believe it's numbers always go first. Then I think string literals go second. And then third are, I can't remember right now. But yeah, there's an ordering. So numbers, then strings, and then whatever the third thing is, might be tuples or whatever. Yeah, so again, don't rely on ordering for dictionaries or objects, but Python kind of built that in later. So I guess you could take advantage of it if you want to. But otherwise, yeah, dictionaries, objects, pretty similar between the two languages. Okay, last thing I'm going to talk about is a set, and I just want to, you're probably not going to use sets in our cohort. They're not widely used, but they're good to know about. They can be handy in certain cases. So a set is an unordered collection. So when we talk about ordering, again, if ordered collections mean when you insert something, it's going to preserve that order. Sets do not preserve order. Sets, however, give you uniqueness. So if I create a set, you use curly braces to create a set in Python. That will basically weed out all duplicates and only give you back single instances. So in this case, I have a set with various numbers in it. I have duplicates, like I have multiple 2s in here, right? 2, 2, 2. When I print out my set, it should only give me back 1, 2, no matter how many 2s I originally had. So if I do Python pi, notice I get 2. It looks like it did sort it. I don't know if that's always going to be the case, but my initial ordering was not preserved. This can be handy, like if I have a, let's create a string. Let's do s equals hello papa. Use lower cases. I could actually throw this into a set. So I do that works. So let me print that out. Print new set. Right. It's not what I want.
Maybe turn it into a list first.
Yeah. Good call. Good call.
I think you need the string
Set,
inside of the
set
curly.
keyword.
That's, oops. Sorry, I did do this before, but
There you go.
thank you. Okay, there we go. So that's what I was intending. So this basically took the string, I converted it to a list, and then convert that list to a set. So it kind of weeded out all the individual letters, but no duplicates. So I have, two P's in Papa, I have 2 L's in hello, I only get 1 result. So that can be useful depending on what you're trying to do. If you only want unique instances, but not duplicates, sets are the way to go. And yet you can create a set using set or using curly braces. All right, so that's sets. Again, you probably won't see that too often, but they're good to know about in case you come up with a case where you need to use it. All right, let's continue on. So we talked about data structures. Let's talk about control flow. Again, these are if statements, for loops, while loops, something we should be familiar with at this point. Just gotta know about the syntax. So let's get back to split string. Okay, so as we're familiar in JavaScript, we do if keyword, then we use round parentheses and maybe do something like x equals greater than 5, curly braces, and maybe do something. All right, so we need to declare x, obviously, but x equals 9. All right, so nothing crazy going on here. If we use parentheses and then we declare a block of scope. You can do the same thing in Python. My Python file go. In Python, we simply declare a variable. Again, don't need to use any keyword. If statement, same thing, same keyword. You don't need parentheses in this case. So you can add them. So I could do x greater than 5. You put a colon to kind of end that if condition. All right. So instead of curly braces, you need to use a colon. Don't forget the colon there. And then you could simply do a print. And of course, I did that again. Hopefully you guys are better about this than I am, but print x is greater than 5. Let's actually use string interpolation. Get the value of x. So for JavaScript, we gotta use backticks, gotta use that curly braces, and use a $sign for JavaScript. Okay, so notice just differences. We use colon. We don't need curly braces. These parentheses are optional. So in this case, I can leave them off and Python is fine with them. In JavaScript, that is not so cool. So this is going to give me some errors. There's those red squiggly lines. If I ran this, I'd get an error. So just notice those syntax differences. But otherwise, nothing too crazy. Else, so if I want to add an else, totally can. Same thing, Python has an else keyword, so nothing too crazy there. Okay, so else statements are the same. Else if statements are just slightly different. So if I wanted to do an else if here, hopefully you guys know else if is a keyword in JavaScript. So let's do something like this. Right. The only difference in Python, you want to use elif instead of else if. Again, they just condense it, I think, to save you time. There is no else if. If you try to do else if, it'll kind of be like, what are you trying to do? Okay, so else if does not exist. You got to condense it to elif. Just be aware of that. Otherwise, they behave exactly the same thing. It's working as an else if. So that's all cool. All right, any questions about if statements? Just again, get familiar with the syntax. Remember to add the colon after your condition, and that's probably the biggest hurdle there. All right, so if statements, we're good with those, hopefully. Then we have for loops. So for loops, again, pretty similar. However, there is the limitation in, so in JavaScript, we do something like let I equal some data here. So okay, so if we want to iterate through that array here, we could do that pretty easily. Start with I equals 0. So that's going to be your index value, I less than data dot length. And increment upwards. So we can just print it. Console log the data I. Right. So traditionally we're used to for loops being this way.
Got let.
Thank you. So yeah, we have a for loop, not a let loop. But we have a for loop where we create a variable, and then we have a condition that checks how long we should execute that for loop for, and then we our incrementer. So this will go through our list and print it out. There's nothing directly equivalent in Python in terms of for loop for this. So if I want to do something the same way, let me copy my data. In Python, you have a little more limitations for for loops. So if I want to iterate over this, I still can using a for loop. However, I would do something like for x in data. Prints x. So what this is going to do is going to go through each value in data, capture that in a variable called x, and then print out x here. So again, I can name this whatever I want. I can name this number, and then my variable will be number. So we have something similar in JavaScript. So we do the same thing for let's number of data. double check this. So node yes. All right, so we get of keyword, easy mistake to make. If you use in, you'll get something different. Does anyone know the difference between of and in? Let's find out. So let me comment this out. Let's go here. So I do of, that's going to go through all my values. Oops, forgot not coders. Not good. All right, so notice I get 1, 4, 66, 7, 8. That is what my data is. If I do in, it's actually going to print out the indices. So notice I get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm actually capturing the index value, not the values. Easy mistake to make. I remember I was working on a challenge. I used in, I was looking at my code. I'm like, why is this not working? Just gotta know in JavaScript, you use of. It's just with arrays. All right, so we're doing the same thing here. In Python, you do use in, so that could be kind of confusing. But if I do Python hello.py, notice we get our numbers out: 1, 4, 66, 7, 8. All right, so you can iterate over a list in that manner. You can't do the same thing like this with a for loop, but you can simulate it with a while loop. So if you did really want to do something like this, you could do something. Well, let's introduce while loops. While I is less than len data. So this is something worth mentioning. Len is how you get the length of a data structure in Python. Sorry, in JavaScript, you do .length. In Python, there's a len function that exists for data structures. Again, it's going to be probably the biggest headache, just kind of adjusting to the syntax, but you guys will get it down, I'm sure. All right, so I need to define I, of course. So I equals 0. We need to increment I and data. So what I've written now is effectively what you might write as a for loop in JavaScript. So here we have a index variable, condition, and incrementer. Same thing here, index variable, condition, incrementer. Python does not, I know I'm kind of just highlighting differences, does not have that shortcut. You can't do I++ like you do in JavaScript. Just subtle differences worth knowing. So you get an error if you try to do that. So that's why I did I plus equals 1, which again is the same thing as doing I equals I plus 1. Same thing. Either way. All right, so that's how you can kind of simulate a for loop if you wanted to. But there are other ways to go about it. So let's see. You can iterate over a dictionary. So if you want to iterate over a dictionary, totally can.
Hey, Ankur, for the for loop there, can't you also use, I think it's the range function. So like for number in range, len, and then data or whatever.
Yep, that is a good point, probably worth mentioning. So range is a function that will kind of just give you the index values from your data structure. So in this case, range is going to take len of data. Sorry. So it's going to, basically we're getting a length. So length of this would be what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You put in an integer. Range will kind of make that integer into enumeration. So from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not including 6. And then this would do the same thing too. So in this case, this would be index. And yep, you can get your index that way, or if you want to put data values, it would be data. Yep, that, I guess that would be another way to kind of simulate a for loop, but still using that in keyword rather than what we're familiar with in JavaScript. Good, cool. All right, let's go over flipping over dictionaries. I guess we could also do something called enumerate, so you guys can kind of follow along on the curriculum page. But enumerate will actually give you back the index and the value, so it's kind of handy if you need both. So you could use enumerate, pass in your list, and then you can get back the index and value. So X will be your value, I will be your index, like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Looping over dictionaries, let's do that. All right, so I have a dictionary. Donuts are indeed yummy. Green beans, I am not a fan, so they are icky. If you want to iterate over dictionary, you could simply do K in and then just go through your dictionary. That K stands for key, but again, this can be any value. I can name this key if I want to. I can name this, any variable. It's just, I'm creating a variable here. So you're free to name it what you wish. So I get all the keys, iterate through it, and then print out my values this way by accessing the value through my dictionary using the key. But you could also, dictionaries have some additional functions. They have values. I think they also have items, which will give you back the key and value, similar to enumerate for lists. But in this case, if you use values, you can iterate through values directly. Keep in mind, we mentioned dictionaries in Python preserve ordering, so you can, rely on that if you want to, but usually not good practice to use dictionaries if you need ordering. All right. What questions you guys have about data structures?
Ankur, for updating the value in a dictionary for a key value pair, is it just, for example, my dict, and then you just put the name of the existing key and then set it equal to something? Is that?
Yep, you got it. So donuts, let's say green beans. Let's say I've changed my mood on them. I'll say, okay, tasting. Yep, that's the way you would update the value. Same thing you would do in JavaScript for objects. But you cannot do the dot notations. I can't do, let's say donuts. Actually, let's see. So we're in Python. Let's print out our dictionary. Yeah, so you can't do the dot notation with Python. In JavaScript, that would totally fly. Hopefully you guys can believe me, but if not, we could quickly do it. So if we had the same thing in JavaScript, obviously we can't do these. But if we had a dictionary, we could do mydict.donuts and then very yummy.shiplet.
Thank you.
Yep. Great questions. Love it when you guys ask questions. So if you guys have any more, please ask.
I wanted to throw in, today I was able to use .items on a dictionary to great success. So that I could pull out both the key and the value at the same time and use them.
Yep. And then again, I know I'm mentioning a lot of like built-in functions. I'm not sure if we say this before, but we probably will state this 20 times throughout this cohort. Reading documentation is part of a software developer's job, and you're going to be probably doing it a lot. So just kind of understand that it's part of the job. So if you aren't familiar with dictionaries, all you got to do is type Python dictionary and methods. Right, so it looks like W3 schools, great site. So all of these methods exist for dictionaries. So we talked about values, right? I kind of highlighted values. Items was one I mentioned, but again, there's no magic way to know about it other than just reading documentation. So, if you want to get the keys, there's a method to get keys. I guess clear, remove all elements. So if you want to clear it out, again, some built-in methods that exist with all of these data structures. So there's a lot more to discover. Obviously, we're not going through each and every method, but understand that there's documentation on the web. Google is your friend. So if you're like, hey, I have no ideas what these methods do, I'm not sure which methods exist, simply just Google it and kind of go through the documentation.
Hey, Ankur, talking about tuples in Python, it seems like a very restrictive data set to kind of use, something where we would probably have to go hard code it every single time we want to change it. Is there like a case scenario that you can kind of throw at us, like an easy one to be like, hey, this is probably when you should use tuples versus like, yeah, when should we use tuples?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good use case. Again, tuples, understanding them, they're meant for constant data, immutable data. So tuples, that's a good use case.
Would tuples help for security at all or anything? Like, is that kind of, they make it more secure at all or anything?
I mean, yeah, again, if you don't want data to change, you should be using tuples. But I'm trying to create like a real world scenario. So sorry, yeah, I don't have a great example for it, but just understand you probably won't be using tuples too often, but they do exist for a reason. And that reason is if you need values to be consistent or immutable, as we saw for like a dictionary, if you for a reason need to have a series of numbers as a key, then, you'd use a tuple. Like this
Actually,
might be a bad example, but like, if I wanted to have like a dictionary of social security numbers and I want to store those as tuples for whatever reason, I could have like tuple and then, say SSN equals 111. Like, let's say I want to break out each component of a social security number, then I might store it like this. And this is something that should not change for my purposes. So this kind of protects the developer from, accidentally changing this and ruining what they intended. Sorry, someone else was saying something?
yeah, I wanted to throw in, so I posted in chat like a call to where I get a tuple back. So if you go back to where we're talking about, it shows the methods of a dictionary there. You just had it up. It says it returns a tuple. Well, what that does is it allows me to go ahead and assign both, the two values inside this tuple that it returns to different variables and then use them. So it also allows me to return two values from a function if I want to do it that way. And then I'm not going to necessarily, I might not use the tuple exactly. I might say, hey, do something with this function, and then it gives me back two values, and then I assign those to other variables and then go use them somewhere else.
Sorry, you lost me a little bit there, but
Oh, okay, sorry. So let's see. So when we call dot items, right? I have in chat, I have Roman to Arabic map dot items. So what it's giving me is a tuple. And when I say, 4-letter comma Arabic, I pull the values out of the tuple, and now I can use them. I don't need to modify this tuple at all. I just need the value from them. And so what items is doing is it's returning an iterable object or an iterable list of tuples, and it's giving me both my key and the value that's there.
gotcha, yeah.
So it's not really something you use so much as like I think someone mentioned you more interact. Like Guillermo's talking about here. You deal with them where it's like you get it, you open it up, you get the values out, you do something with it, and then you move on.
Gotcha. Okay, yep. So again, there are use cases for ISI. I don't have great use cases, but yeah, again, you won't really be dealing with them in the cohort. Just want to introduce them because that's something that exists in Python. All right, let's continue moving on. Let's try to wrap up before lunch. So where were we? All right, so we did for loops, again, while loops, effectively the same deal. Again, the syntax here, while is a keyword, use that colon, so don't forget about that. Otherwise, they behave the same way as they do in JavaScript. So I'm going to kind of skip over while loops because again, you guys should be familiar with them in JavaScript. So they're the same in Python. The break keyword behaves the same way in JavaScript and Python. So that is something I want to highlight because maybe we haven't gone over that in JavaScript too much in detail. So there's this break keyword. Has everyone seen the break keyword before? Everyone kind of familiar with it? If not, we can talk about it. So break is a keyword that lets you abort a loop before it completes. So in this case, we're using that range function that we kind of introduced. This for loop is intending to go through each number from 0 to 9 and print that out. However, we have some special case here for whatever reason that when x becomes any value greater than 4, we want to abort the loop. So that's what a break statement is going to do. Break says, don't continue the loop, just quit the loop and proceed on. Break only breaks the initial loop that it's in. So here I have a nested for loop, right? I have a range of 10 and then going from 10 to 20 in another loop. This break keyword is going to abort this loop only, but it's going to continue this loop. All right, so good use of break. Here we have a while true, which looks like an infinite loop, right? This means this while loop is going to execute forever, but this break keyword is actually going to let us abort it. So if we're looking for user input, we could get input from the user. If they type anything that's not equal to quit, we'll keep looping. So let's actually run this and see what happens. Clear Python. Okay, so a few things happened here. We printed out these loops. There's a bunch of numbers. I'm just going to ignore those. So let's comment those out. I'll keep this one in here. Right. So I'm going to clear my console. Oops. All right, so I'm just gonna run this. I have a for loop and a while loop that I'm running. All right, so notice I printed out 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I did not proceed after 4 because we got to a value of x equals 5, and that satisfied this condition, which means we hit this break and every other value will no longer be printed out because this loop will no longer execute. Then in my second loop, I have a while true. I'm trying to get an input from the user. If you guys remember from the Def Grammar Challenge, you got to use something called prompt for Node. That is not the case for Python. Input will do the job for you. So it's going to halt execution and wait on the user to enter something. So in this case, let's say donuts as your command. All right, you enter donuts, enter a command. All right, this is going to go on forever and ever. I can sit here all day and just keep typing. The only thing that will get me out of this is this special condition here. If I actually type quit, that's going to match this condition. I'm going to break out of it. All right, so if I type quit, there we go. We quit out of our application. All right, so that's a break keyword. Again, you guys will be using that probably to kind of understand. This is the biggest point I want to make. Break only will get you out of the inner loop. The outer loop will still continue. So keep that in mind. Continue is another keyword to use with loops. Continue will abort the current iteration, but continue the loop. So what I mean by that, let's just copy this code since we have code to use. Let's run this. It's not bad. Oh, sorry. Let's make that equal to 4. All right, so in this case, when we get to x equals 4, we're saying, I don't want to continue on for this particular iteration, but I don't want to abandon this loop. I just want to get to the next value. So notice in my output, I get 0, 1, 2, 3. I don't have a 4 in there because this 4 said kind of continue without executing the next line. So that's why the 4 is missing, but the rest of the loop did continue. So in this case, I think that this be equals 4, not greater than 4. For else, this is a little more advanced. I'm not going to kind of go over it because we're running short on time, but you can add an else block to a for loop. It's kind of wacky. You can't really do this in JavaScript, but this is possible in Python. I'll let you guys kind of do your own research there, but there are some additional ways you can attack on an else to certain control statements. All right, so that kind of covers our basic introduction to Python. Again, a lot of this should have been familiar from JavaScript, just kind of understand those syntax difference we talked about, those few exceptions, like, dictionaries have preserved ordering in Python, but in JavaScript, they don't necessarily preserve the ordering. Using the and or keyword instead of the double ampersand, double pipes, just syntax stuff like that, you'll get used to it as you're going through it. There's no triple equals in Python. Double equals is the only equality comparison that you can do, and that effectively is triple equals in JavaScript. What else did we go over? We talked about tuples. Don't worry about them. You're not going to be working with them too much. Lists and arrays, you guys are cool with that. So I think we covered pretty much everything that we need to cover there. What questions you guys have about anything Python related to?
So when we first moved on over to JavaScript and started running Node on VS Code, and we couldn't do the prompt, is there anything kind of technical like that with Python that we should also be aware of?
No, so as I said, Python's kind of meant to be terminal based, or Node, kind of just the history of it. JavaScript initially was made for web browsers. So that's what JavaScript was used for. Node was created so that you could run JavaScript outside of a web browser. It's an engine that can parse JavaScript and kind of run it for you, but it doesn't have that UI that JavaScript kind of relies on. So that's why in the Def Grammar example, we had to download an additional, library that simulates the prompt where it can actually halt your execution and wait for user input that a UI would normally give you from a web browser. So in Python, that's kind of automatically built in, like the input function that I kind of showed right here, input. All you gotta do is input, enter a prompt, and the application will wait for you. So yeah, you don't have to download anything additional for that. Yep. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly stop this